So the topic that we're doing today is imprisonment in the USA. Started off with mass imprisonment because we do so much, but I just chose imprisonment and noted that you could also call it another fucking disgraceful monolith of stupidity, which the US seems to have a lot of. I start off with just a little bit about my personal interest in imprisonment. So back in my Christian days, I was actually in prison ministry for about 7 years. Went in every week, got to know the guys very well, and actually became personally invested in them and their lives. Yeah. We helped them when they got out. We started helping them getting housing and work and some stability when they're released, because those are some of the things that are the biggest causes of recidivism, going back into it. And we stayed in touch with them. One of us sent us Christmas cards for an occasional letters for, I don't even know, it was at least a decade. So, but at some point we seem to have lost touch, but he was a really good guy. Another one, my personal thing, I had a record for 2 years, so I know what it feels like to be not an ex-con. I didn't go to prison, but to be carrying around a record. Apartments wouldn't take me in, so I found myself on Craigslist poring over trying to find some private home that somebody would let me in at. And I got turned down for jobs deliberately when they found this out. So that's when I had to become an independent writer. I didn't really have a choice. So fortunately, the record went away. I filed to have it sealed, so the military could get it. But okay, one quick thing, because a lot of people use jail and prison interchangeably. They are not to be done, not to be used differently. They're not synonymous. Jail is a short-term place. You could get a sentence there, but it's usually less than a year. And the holding is mainly for, you're immediately post-arrest. You haven't had your hearing or trial yet. Your no bail hearing to set it. And otherwise, it's mostly for misdemeanors. You almost never find a felon in the jail except pre-trial and all that. And they are all governed locally by a city or a county. Prisons, on the other hand, they're for the long-term incarceration post-sentencing. So, 20 to life, you're going to be in a prison for a while. They're almost always for felonies. You can occasionally get some serious misdemeanors or multiple misdemeanors together that make up a big sentence. And they're all governed at either state or federal level. First thing I want to point out, whenever you're doing any research, and as a former scientist and writer, I'm really familiar with this. You can get some really bad data out there and you have to pay attention to it. Well, that's why I'm here. Always, 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 always try hard to find errors or bullshit in anything you see, no matter how cool it looks. This one right here, oh yeah, sorry. If the stuff agrees with you, you probably should put even more effort into confirming it because your biases are there. If somebody says something like, atheists are right, we all would say, yeah, of course. But try to tear your own opinion apart. That's how I gave up Christianity. And now you see this fancy chart, 74% of people held in jails are not convicted of any crime. Ooh, no shit, Captain Obvious. Look, just like I said before, jails are for holding immediately, post-arrest, pre-hearing, pre-trial, pre-bail, all that. So yeah, duh, most of them haven't been convicted of anything. They haven't even been to court. So, but the chart sure looks way cool, doesn't it? Must have taken that guy hours and hours to make that bullshit. Okay, right to the big matter. How serious is the problem of imprisonment in the United States? If you've never learned anything about this, you're probably going to find out that it's far worse than you even imagined. Numerically, We have 5% of the entire global population, actually more like 4. We have 25% of the world's prisoners. Staggering. Right now, we have 2.3 million people in jails and prisons. You would think there might be at least one other country, China, India, bigger than us, that would have more. China has 1.7. I mean, it's one thing to beat them on a ratio, but it's ridiculous to beat them on sheer outright numbers. Since 1970, our incarcerated population has increased by 700%. You'll see something about that in just a minute. Hello. It doesn't want to advance.
Sometimes you may need to get out of presentation mode.
There we go. That made it. Okay, 700%. That's much greater than the population growth or the crime increase. So you just can't explain it by anything other than we're trying to put more people in prison. What a great idea.
And that 700, did you say 700%
Yes, sir.
is of world prisoners?
Oh, no. Our incarcerated population has increased by 7. So if you went back to 1970, divide 2.3 million by 700 and or multiply it by 0.7, whichever way. Oh no, that would be by 7. Divide by 7 anyway, a lot easier. And women are the fastest growing incarcerated population in the United States. That's partly getting tough on crime and partly because you get more prisons with more money, which we'll also get to. Now here's the racial divide. I'm sure you all have heard about this. If you're a white child, a white boy in particular, and born today, you have about a 1 in 17 chance of going to prison at some point in your life. Doesn't sound good, but you know, oops, what if you're Mexican, Latino of any kind? Now it's 1 out of 6. Here's where it gets sickening. If you're black, your chances are 1 out of 3. And if anybody doesn't know, blacks make up, depending on where you're looking, they make up sometimes as many as 90% of prisoners. They almost always make up over 50. Oh, more of how big is the problem. This chart is every state of the union being treated as a country all by itself. The first place where you get down here and you find a country, that guy, El Salvador, in place number 33. So taking out the US, it's 31 of our states have more prisoners than the next best country. And this is as a ratio. And you can see after that, we do pretty well until you get run out of the United States and then you start seeing countries. We're good. We're number 1. Yay. Okay, I already put that 32 states before you get to a country. And definitely sad and heartbreaking. Land of the free. So how'd this problem come about? It's a huge problem that brings mass incorporation, a shitload of factors just like that truck. There have been entire graduate dissertations, research papers, all that written on it. Consequently, since this presentation was not slated as a 6-week college course, we're not going to get to everything. We'll just try to touch on some major issues. And you can go research it yourself if you want to spend like a whole semester worth of digging in. It's crazy. How did this problem come about? There are multiple factors. One of them, laws. I do want to point out, I mentioned the 700%. 1970, we had roughly, not a remarkable number of prisoners compared to the rest of the world. Jim Crow laws ended in about 65. You would think that would have helped. No. The South got pissed. So they started jailing them in greater numbers. Then you got the 1970s and onward where it really started rocketing. Why? Anybody remember Tough on Crime? Was that Ruff the dog? And the war on drugs? Incarceration went from 100 per 100,000 population to 500 per 100,000 population. And it's continued to increase. So you saw that, there was attitudes in the law. There's also changes in how people are convicted or sentenced in the law. Harsher sentencing laws, therefore longer sentences overall, more people staying longer. Mandatory sentencing, one of my personal favorites. I mentioned the guy that sent us Christmas cards for years. He had a mandatory minimum 12 years. He had sex with a 17-year-old girl who looked 25. Great. And you've all heard of the 3 strikes laws, in case you don't know how that works. If you get one severe violent felony and then 2 other convictions, you win our prize of mandatory sentence of 25 years to life. That's the 3 strikes law. That's mandatory. The judge doesn't have a frickin' choice. Then criminal liability extended to people who weren't really involved in the crime. For instance, they conspired about the crime with the person who committed it. So encourage it. You can be considered guilty or at least associated. Accomplice liability, if you're involved in or associated with the crime in any way, whether you conspired or not, they just kind of, they recruited you to be the getaway driver or something. Constructive possession. I love legal terms. If you have control over possessions or real estate associated with drug crimes, you're an associate. So make damn sure that your kids never store anything in the basement that you're not certain about. Now, I mentioned arrests. I'll get to deinstitutionalization in a minute. And capitalism, what better to cause problems in some places. There was a dramatic increase in drug arrests and increase in their penalties. The war on drugs, as I just mentioned. Whoops. More arrests across the board, mostly for drugs, but also for violent offenses and just about anything that could get you a good conviction with some years on it. And nonviolent offenders are getting arrested and convicted and in many cases incarcerated. And then there are reduced parole opportunities. So prisoners must serve 85% of their sentences, unless you get really lucky and your appeal happens to succeed. And here, deinstitutionalization of the mentally ill or disabled. How to help somebody? Throw them in a jail or a prison. There were many treatment facilities, particularly for the mentally ill, that were shut down. That's resulted in more prisoners and more homelessness. Fewer community resources to help treat those mentally ill. So if you committed a crime and you hardly know better, tough shit. I got 40 to 72,000 people in prisons who should be in mental hospitals getting appropriate treatment. And then my very, very favorite of all time, privatized prisons. The dumbest fucking idea I've ever heard of. 10% of prisons now are run for profit. Can you imagine trying to get a prisoner out of there when profit is headcount? Oof, nasty. Oh, and I've saw that the private prisons usually have stricter standards on behaviors of the incarcerated. So it's a little harder to get out. So a little more, we're looking at convictions and sentencing again. So they found that incarceration is actually ineffective at reducing a lot of crimes, notably youth crimes and drug crimes. they had this idea if you attack the market for drugs, that would help. Unfortunately, it's really easy to replace their market. It's just kids on the street or other people on the street. So it's absolutely effective. Net effect on crime, drug crime has really not gotten a lot worse or better. So thanks a lot. Prison population, though, is going up. Yay. Then recidivism rates decline markedly with age. You let a 30-year-old out of prison, he's still young, he's energetic, he's got contacts and maybe in criminal enterprises. You let a 70-year-old out of jail, he hasn't got the energy to go commit more stupidity. He just wants to, live the rest of his life. So you don't do lengthy sentences for those kind of people, unless they've done something like the really high rate of repeat offenders or extremely dangerous offenders. Serial killers will still be put in for life, most likely. There's another thing that makes stuff fun. I discovered this when I got my record that I mentioned. You think the free phone call? Not really. Unless you have a number handy to write down before your phone's taken away. You have to have a way to handle the charge. They are not free. This amazed me when I got in. Nobody talked to me about Miranda rights. Oh, really? Apparently, that's legal if you are not going to be questioned before a court hearing. So if they're just going to arrest me, hold me in the cell for a day, and then take me to court, you are not informed of your Miranda rights. And since you don't get a free call, you might not even be able to get your lawyer if you have one. And then, this is a fun one, defendants are often told to appear in hearings about probable cause or bail without any legal consultation. That was what I got.
You don't get a public defender?
I'm sorry?
Public defender?
Nothing. No legal advice, no legal representation. There wasn't even a lawyer. Oh no, there was one lawyer in there that we could talk to. Those of us who were let in the chain gang, literally. And that person basically just, okay, we have to ask, do we have this recourse? And she'd say, yeah. No help with it. It's amazing. I had no idea till this happened to me. So I got let in a chain gang. You're asked to plea bargain or plead guilty on the spot, again, with no legal representation. The only lawyer that's going to talk to you much is probably a prosecutor who will say, here's the deal we're going to give you. Now that you've spent a day or two in jail, you're confused, you're tired, you haven't had a chance to change your clothes, you haven't had any legal representation, and you probably haven't talked to anybody outside. Here's your plea deal from the prosecutor. No guidance. Nope, none. You do have the right, but they didn't read you Miranda, so tough shit. And why do they do this? That's what I also learned. High throughput, more convictions, and it's so fast. You see, what is it? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, maybe a 6th guy on the end. That's about what my little chain gang was. And they would just unshackle you, keep your handcuffs on, put you up in the thing, and the prosecutor was like, plead guilty to this charge, we'll knock off the other one. I just want to go home. This is my favorite thing about convictions and sentencing right here. One of my favorites, but when I read this, it's a jaw dropper. U.S. Code, imposition of sentence of imprisonment, actors to be considered in imposing a term of imprisonment. Get the yellow. Recognizing that imprisonment is not an appropriate means of promoting correction or rehabilitation. Sentencing you even knowing that it doesn't do what you think a prison was supposed to do. Get rid of crime. My reaction when I first heard it, You probably did too. The social environment of prisons. Oddly enough, this is one of the few times when TV actually gets it right. I found this out from the prisoners we did ministry with for so many years. You can be confined in cells up to 23 hours a day during, certain types of maintenance or construction on the site, higher security incidents, and so forth. No programs, no social interaction during these long periods of incarceration. Well, they don't even need solitary to put you in all day. Vocational training and educational programs are not used as widely as they should be. The guys that we did prison ministry with were in a minimum security yard for felonies, minimum security. Their vocational opportunities were quite limited. They're often overcrowded in prisons and jails. There's a great increase in suicide risk for people who are in there because life sucks a lot. There's a danger of attack and abuse. You hear about the rapes with the butt rapes in prison. Yep, they're real. And there's a gang mentality in practice. Again, the guys who are in there, we asked about prison gangs. They said, when you come into prison, one of the first things you learn is join a gang. Doesn't matter which, just find a gang you fit in with and join it. Because if you try to go solo, you're going to end up like Big Stan there in his movie. You're going to have to fight on your own. Once you join a gang, much less likely people are going to attack you because then they know that, all the Mexicans or whatever will stand behind you. I didn't know this. This was real. Their gang was the Christian gang. And I said, what happens if somebody attacks you? They said, we activate the verse all Christians know, great is the Lord who makes my fingers mighty for battle. In other words, they have to swing. There's a lovely one. If you have Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, all those, they'll discontinue them and try to get them when you get back out with a record. Ew. Most prisons require co-pays for medical visits. You're in frickin' prison. How much money do you have? Prison job wages, and they are way lower than minimum wage. Back when I did the ministry, I think minimum wage was $5 or $6 an hour. Theirs was like $1.50. So that also deters them from getting preventative or routine care, whether it's for mental problems or physical problems. Great place to get sick in prison. Mental health treatment, it's difficult to get. Most prisons don't have adequate health treatments. A few do. And the same problem exists in low security, but they're usually less severe. And again, the guys we did prison ministry with, a lot of this they would confirm for us. Now, what happens when you're released? We're not free. Paying your debt to society by being in prison, it's a myth. That's why I had a record for 2 years and couldn't get a job. Payment will stick around. You'll be paying long after the sentence is supposed to be over. Where'd they go? And here's a little cutie for you. The number is 45,000. That equals the approximate number of laws, policies, sanctions, regulations where getting out of prison, they specify where you can live, who you can live with, where you can spend your time, what you can do for work, and what educational opportunities you can access. You're out of frickin' prison. Come on.
Is this considered parole?
This could be parole. It can also even be post-parole to some extent because like, what I had. You've got a frickin' record. It controls things like this. And I had they gave me a paper that said the things you can't do. You can't have a weapon. You can't drink or do any kinds of drugs. It's just a big old long list of stuff that I was not allowed to do. So if I went to a party, it's just like, guys, don't hand me a beer. one error could put you back in prison. Likely, it probably won't, but if your parole officer or a cop who sees you is just having a bad day or doesn't like you, they could report that one error. You know, they saw me drinking a beer. Hey, Mike, I'm not going to have you around alcohol. Get back in jail.
So when you say they tell you where you can live, that means even to the city level or to the state level?
All,
So if you want to get out of the bad environment that caused you to go to prison, it's hard to do. Is that what?
it is hard to get away from those kind of environments. You know, usually like me, I couldn't leave the state.
Okay.
I did leave once. I talked to my parole officer. She gave me specific clearance for 3 days, which is what I told her to take. But yeah, it can be very hard to get away. One of the things about who you can live with does include former conspirators. Or, you know, so if you and I robbed a bank together, we're not supposed to talk to each other afterwards until probably parole is over. So that little bit, the way you described it, not being able to associate with your former accomplices, that's one bit that actually could be a little good.
No, but I'm saying if everybody that you know that you could potentially live with is in that same environment that you were arrested in, right?
Yes.
And you're only allowed to live with certain people.
Yep.
Then you're back in that environment that potentially will cause you to go right back to jail.
Exactly.
Because if you say, for example, you got arrested in Denver, that's where all your friends are, that's where the bad influences are, right?
Yeah.
But you want to go live in Pueblo because you know you can get away from it. If you can only live with people that live in Denver,
Yep.
You're stuck.
Yep. You're right. And I will say that I do know this. If you want to live away from them and you can do it, you can almost always clear that with the courts. Sometimes it's already allowed,
Oh, okay.
but you can almost always get away with that.
Okay.
The only exceptions would be things like house arrest or limited area arrest with like those ankle bracelets. That's the only real exception. And even then you can probably tell them, I don't want to be back in the old neighborhood. I want to move to Fort Collins.
Okay, so that is allowed. That's good.
Yeah, but it's not a guarantee. It's just usually they'll see the sense of it. But as you're gathering, courts don't always see sense in anything. So here's release. I may get to a little bit about this. You're arrested and convicted. You're now a separate class of citizen. You're kind of cut off from society in a lot of ways because, you know, you get a lot of jobs are hard to get. You're limited as to where you can be. And you're often deprived of essentials like shelter, good income from your job, communities to be part of, safety. If they force you to go back into the old hood, like you said, this isn't going to be very good. That's not allowed. Landlords with decent housing only need to say, ooh, you have a record? Fuck off. I had this problem. I couldn't get into a set of apartments anywhere.
But that's because it's the insurance companies, and it's just a fact of life. Like when I was in business, my workman's comp, if my workman's comp would, or whatever my different insurances, as soon as they find out. But the thing is, if I hire 100 people with a prison record, I'm going to have 5 or 10 of them screw up. If I hire 100 of them without a prison record, only 1 or 2. So there is an increased risk. If you've been to prison, it's not just a stupid thing society does. It's real. There's a real effect.
Yep. Yes, sir.
I would like to add to that. In my past, I managed a car rental agency. I was the manager. The owner was absent. Made all the decisions, including hiring. A former prisoner came to interview, and I knew he would be a good worker. There were jobs washing cars, but because he was a prisoner, and I'm ashamed to say this, I did not hire him because there was a risk of money being taken from the till, and And that individual, in my mind, presented a possible risk.
And if you on your own took a risk on him, and then he did, which you know that his chances, you don't know people, but you know the probability of a guy who's been in prison is 3 times higher to steal from the till than a guy who hasn't been. And if you take a chance on him and he steals, guess who's going to get fired
And that
for
is
good
correct.
cause?
That is
For
correct,
good
because
cause.
if someone stole money from the till, I had to replace it. It was personal money that was at stake, not just the company's money.
So this is a really good discussion. I want to save this. No, I want you to get through your presentation, and we'll bring this up again, and we'll allow people on Zoom to interact as well. But yes, great point, guys. Great
That's a
point.
good way to break in there, because you're the moderator. So good job.
That's what
Cheryl.
she's here for.
Get us back in.
All right, so the landlords who do rent to people with records, it's usually kind of crappy places. So not fun. And how do you deal with shit like this? I'm sorry, that says how many, it's supposed to say how many. How many people have to deal with this kind of shit? There are over 70 million adults in America who have either a criminal record or an arrest record. An arrest record without a conviction is still going to cost you a whole lot of trouble. And there's sort of a semi-law out there that says that you should only exclude them if the crime makes sense relative to what you're hiring. You don't want to put an embezzler in a bank. But nobody follows that. And it's impossible to do anything about it. So yes, 1 out of every 4 people dealing with some level of this kind of shit I've been talking about. And so now it's been 50 years since 1970. We've gotten more punitive in our so-called justice. All we've got is a culture of mass incarceration and arrest.
You said
And a
mass
large
incorporation.
incarceration.
I do have that as well.
I apologize
Yeah.
for bringing that up.
No, you're exactly right. They are 2 different things. Yeah. So yeah, mass imprisonment, mass arrest. It's a mass mess. There's one other thing about release. You see that guy with that sign? That could have been me if I hadn't had some skill that I could sell in a sort of a, not normal way, but I at least didn't have to tell people about what I had. Here's another one, mental health. Imprisonment, as you might guess, can create your mental health problems or make them worse. Yeah, not very surprising. They're not usually treated very well or even correctly when you're in there. And then when you come out, there's no pass off to some social mental health group or something. Some places do have it, but it's the exception rather than the rule. So let's combine mental health problems with being deprived of shelter, income, community, and safety. And what are you going to get? People like this, or homelessness, sitting there and going, I lived in the nice house next to you. Now this is the best I can manage. So here's the thing about recidivism I mentioned earlier. Within 1 year after release, 44 to 57% of prisoners are rearrested. They may not be reincarcerated, but they're rearrested. Within 3 years, 68% were rearrested. Within 5 years, 78% had been rearrested. And within 9 years, 83% of them had been rearrested because they don't have something to belong to help them, and they get desperate and they do stupid shit. When I did the prison ministry, our record for the first year and a half to 2 years was almost 90% recidivism. We'd see these guys again. Once we started establishing the exterior network, the recidivism rate for our guys went from 90 to roughly 25. So a good exterior program made absolutely gigantic difference. Whew, sorry, I almost got emotional thinking about those guys. Social and personal cost to society, not the guys, to us. You got social exclusion of them. Whoops, they're not protected. So we've got these people out there who are scared, they're unprotected, they do stupid shit, they get desperate, they get rearrested. But they need protection just as much as any of the rest of them. One that I thought was weird, I knew one guy who got arrested by a cop. Cop ran his, ID, found out that he had a record. So the cop's whole attitude became more vicious. He just got him in the car, took him down there, put an official charge on the guy. I mean, it was just
Because in the cop, I'm just standing up for the cop. In the cop's mind, he goes from a simple interaction to somebody who's had a record. The cop must elevate his level of, I mean, my heart goes out to these guys too.
Yeah.
Really does. It's just a complicated issue,
It is. And the cops, like you said, they can have that worry. They're not supposed to. It's actually, they are literally not supposed to. It's supposed to be part of their regulations, but cops don't always listen to that. So
Hold your thought, JD.
Okay, thank you.
So here's a lovely one, family separation. When they are in prison, obviously they're separated. Even when they get out, they may be told they cannot live with some family, depending on, variables. If the family member is a former convict too, that may really mess it up. Oh, family separation. Anybody heard about something like this in the news? Like, I don't know, the U.S. border separating without due process. There's this, half of imprisoned people have minor children without mom or dad. Incarcerated women are very frequently their primary caregiver. And it can just devastate the communities, leave families separated. It can keep that family separated forever. It can leave them without income. So incarcerated men, they're not there. They can't provide for their families. They can't set an example for their children or be there to comfort them. They're often unable to support themselves after release for reasons I've kind of gone over a bit. The result is higher rates of poverty, homelessness, which follows from higher rates of poverty, likelihood of mental health and behavioral issues for that younger generation. And I think this is where my favorite comes in. Much greater likelihood of incarceration for the next generation. And that actually is a father and a son. We get the cycle of imprisonment going on. Monetarily, that's a great idea. Social and personal costs again. Women, 80% of women who go to jail every year are mothers. You got about 2.7 million children. 1 out of every 27 in the US have at least one incarcerated parent. Nuts. Every mother that's incarcerated, they figure an average of 10 other people are directly affected. Grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, kids. Also, they can't provide for their families either or help very much. They're absent from their children. So it's pretty much the same for men and women. It's pretty horrid. Fiscal costs, or again, the holy hopping shitballs fiscal cost. Arrests. You get money from arrests, fines and court fees and crap like that. Conviction and sentencing. We can get bail. We can get money from the court costs that you get fined for. And it costs us money, the people in this room who pay taxes. But it goes to the prison system. Court costs, I mentioned, imprisonment. That costs us a lot of money. If it's a private prison, it gives them a lot of money. Release, again, costs us because we have homeless and mentally ill people who don't have any way of taking care of themselves. Parole and halfway houses, again, we have to pay for those. And then recidivism, and we get to go through the whole cycle again and spend a lot of money, and a lot of the court and imprisonment system get that money. So what do we get for all this? State expenditures on corrections in billions from 85 to 2019. Look at that. It's absolute, what is it, 6.7 billion to 56.7 billion. It's like what, about 9-time increase? That's quite outstrips inflation. More on the fiscal costs. This is one I really like. Prison system costs about $1 out of every 15 for state discretionary dollars. It's the fastest growing category of state budgets. Excuse me. 90% of the dollars for all that stuff goes right to prisons, which includes building new ones. More resources that could be elsewhere aren't getting used right, so they don't go to real corrections or rehab. And the annual outlays just continue to increase. They went from, this is federal and state combined. It was $12 billion federal and state combined. It's now over 60. That's sort of an average. And now, for your daily dose of stupidity or dumbness. California Legislative Office calculated that incarcerating one person per year costs almost 52,000. A RAND survey estimated that each auto theft costs 9.5 thousand. Put those together, that's $61,000 that we wind up having to use for an auto theft that gets convicted. And that's just for the first year. And I don't think I put in court costs on that from what I read of the analysis when I put it up here. So here's a better solution. We catch the guy, we probably do something with the car. We take all that money saved and we buy a brand new Tesla for the people who got their cars stolen. Everybody's happy. I'd like a new Tesla. It's the price of a new Tesla to put a car thief in prison. Makes no sense. More dumb? Costs money to build and maintain and staff prisons. We dump a bunch of money in it. That comes from us. Yeehaw. Prisoners don't make much when they're in there, and they pay very little in taxes. So again, the difference falls on us. Unemployed people don't make much, so when they come out, they don't pay much in taxes. So the prisoners and ex-prisoners make very little in taxes, but they cost us a lot in taxes. So the paying of the debt societies financially gets worse. Yeah. And if all this sounds really nasty, it's because it is. It's bad. So what has been or is being done? There are efforts. At the state level, California passed a measure to reclassify certain laws or certain crimes from felonies down to misdemeanors and reinvest some of the costs in prevention programs. Ooh, brilliant. In New York, they reformed the harsh mandatory minimum sentences for lower level offenses. So you don't get, 5 years just for carrying a single dime of coke in your pocket. Pennsylvania revamped its mental health procedures so the prisoners could come out and get better treatment while they're in. And right here at home, they set aside just over $1 million grant to connect released prisoners to jobs. I think that's an idea that should have come a lot sooner, but good for us. And at the federal level, The U.S. established a sentencing committee, and it unanimously voted to reduce a lot of excessive sentences. The same commission, whoops, there we go. They estimated there are about 45,000 people serving federal sentences, and they could qualify for early release. So they put the effort in and got I think out of the 46, I think 42,000 of them were released. What else could be done that we're not up to yet? Get to the wider economic and social conditions that cause crime in the first place, like poverty, drug addiction, poor education. Oh, there was supposed to be one more, maybe it'll pop up. But you can see how all these feed into imprisonment. So they're sensible evidence-based approaches that we know work, such as we put in resources to reduce the impact of mental illness and substance abuse on their recidivism and initial crimes. Community-based alternatives, so you don't have to put them in prison. They could sweep the steps of the Capitol building or something. You can find work. Cut sentences to reduce the number of people. Find resources to help them so that they don't reoffend. And give them vocational training while they're in the prisons. I'm going to go through this real quick. You can eliminate mandatory minimum sentences and make mandatory maximums instead. You cannot sentence to more than 5 years. Cut back on the lengthy sentences, move resources out of prisons and into help. Invest in interventions for promoting strong youth. Deal with delinquency with age-appropriate methods instead of throwing them in prison. Look at the policies that need to be fixed in the so-called justice system that contribute to the racial indiscrepancy or discrepancy, and get rid of all these barriers that hurt them so much when they get out that we've already mentioned. I go through again. I think I put a little bit too much in this. So we need some national initiatives, get rid of a lot of the punitive sentences, make programs that help, and get lower recidivism, lower prison population. And besides, it's sensible. If they serve their time, they should be done. That's why we gave it to them in the first place. Okay, let's look at some people who are doing it right. Europe. They have a whole different idea about incarceration, imprisonment, and courts and convictions. The US's idea is to incapacitate them and punish them. Germany and Holland, they want to re-socialize them and rehabilitate them. Norway has restorative justice. A lot of times the prisoners will do work to fix or replace things that the cost of things they damage. And you can't do that when you're in prison, so they're out there doing it. And they also want to rehabilitate. And they want the prisoners to come out functioning members of society. I don't know if I get to it, but Norway actually does full vocational training in their prisons. If you want to come out and be a carpenter, they will train you to be a carpenter. And when you come out, you can be a carpenter. Germany has a prison act that said that the sole aim of incarceration is to enable them to develop and lead a socially responsible life. They want prison life to be as close to normal. They facilitate a lot of reintegration when they're released. The Netherlands, they like to re-socialize, carry out incarceration with as few restrictions as possible. And Norway has very much the same thing. They actually reformed their system from something that was kind of a leftover from World War II. And now it's the best in the world. It's a model for everybody. Sentences are generally much lower. There's less use of any kind of mandatory sentencing at all. So they get shorter sentences overall, less occupancy of prisons. And how do they do this? This thing over here with incarceration, just there again for comparison. There's a maximum on prison sentences, which is what I talked about. Sunlight's getting hard for me to get by. Let's see. So they don't use imprisonment as frequently, and they keep shorter sentences.
Look at your computer screen.
It's so small I can't
Oh,
see it.
okay.
Non-custodial sanctions or diversions, which basically, you know, cleaning the steps of Capitol Hall, of the Capitol building. They give them training courses. Sometimes they'll use some fines. Community service, easy probation, a few driving restrictions. They will confiscate assets that were used in crimes. So only a small percentage of people actually go to prison. Look at that, 6 or 10% of offenders actually wind up in prisons. Another quick look. I love this one. If you're staff in a European prison, most of them, you get theoretical education and practical education that requires 2 years before you can be an actual guard. They get training in law, they get educational theory, training in basic psychology, stress and conflict management, and communication skills. We don't even give our police that much training. These guys are just doing it for prison staff. Some other things I love here, prisoners are not stripped of their rights. They still retain a right to vote. They still get the welfare benefits if they have them. They get short-term or extended leave so they can go see their family at home. So they can find work or actually go to real work. The failure from home leave, the number who try to run away, less than 1%. Why is that? The worst thing you can do to a European prisoner is say, you can't go out and see your family and friends and go to work. They would rather have solitary than that fine or that. So it's horrible, you know, and so different.
I do apologize for all but we do need to have less criminal offense.
Oh, I'm sorry, I was trying to do it so I was clear. All right.
All good. You did your job. Thank you.
Okay, hopefully that didn't impact my ability to be heard. Okay, this is great. The prisoners hate denial of leave so much that solitary isn't needed. They might use it 2 or 3 times a year throughout their entire prison system. Here's a little more on them. Most of the sentences are less than a year, even more are less than 2 years, and most of them are actually suspended altogether. In the Netherlands, their drug laws are not strong. They use ankle monitors rather than imprisonment to just keep you in an area. And I'm also told that you can expand that area pretty easily as long as you give a good reason. They try to help the prisoners with their problems rather than just punish them. So if you are in a Dutch prison and you have a drug problem, you get addiction treatment. You have aggression trouble, you get anger management training and psychological care. If you got money problems, get counseling. Basically, they try to fix the problem. And how well does it work? There are empty prisons in Holland, and they're converting them, sometimes to shelters for refugees, underprivileged. Some of them have been converted to hotels and business centers, and a few of them have just been torn down altogether. Their former prisons are now helping society with its problems, and some of them are actually turned into things that make money rather than cost. Okay. So they can put in some somewhat more punitive measures, make you do community service that you have to check in, restrict your driving, mandatory mediation, forfeiture of particularly the criminal goods. Where did that? Okay. And here's the results. Their, excuse me, their incarceration rates just ludicrously low. And their recidivism rates are low. Norway, best prison system in the world, has been declared so by almost every country in the world, year after year after year. They focus on restorative justice, rehabilitation, helping the prisoners become functional. And the prison system houses less than 4,000 offenders, and they only have total national capacity for 4,092 prisoners total. They can't have much more than 4,000 prisoners. They don't need it. Their recidivism rate is nearly the lowest on the planet. Only 20 people reoffend anything within 5 years. And the lowest crime rate on earth. The lowest crime rate on earth. There's no death sentence or life imprisonment. None. Zero. Maximum sentence is 21 years, 30 for genocide or crimes against humanity or war crimes. Courts can put more time on if there is a reason why the person has not been fully rehabilitated. I put honest Blavik in there. If you don't know who that guy is, he is the most successful mass murdering, shooting on planet Earth. I don't know if he killed, if I remember correctly, 78 or 79 people in his spree. He planned it. He had military training. He had bombs. He had shitloads of ammunition. And he caught the people he was going to kill isolated on an island, a small island with no way to get off. World's most.
It was a summer camp.
Yeah, it was actually a camp for future leaders. People who had serious aspirations, young people who seriously wanted to become parliament members and stuff like that. So just amazingly successful. No forced labor. Juvenile delinquency centers just aren't even used. Punishment is solely a restriction of liberty. No rights taken away. You can see 0.1% of their prisoners are juvenile. They have to commit a very serious crime to get a juvenile into actual incarceration. 6% are female. It's very few. They know that they're mothers and stuff. They try to keep them out. And about 30% of them are foreign born. The Middle East people and such have been a real problem for Scandinavia because they have a world mind view that's almost completely opposed. So some of the extreme violence and murders in Denmark, Norway, Sweden, a goodly number of them are actually carried out by foreigners. It's a problem. They haven't quite figured out how to deal with it. Okay. No offender is kept in for the whole time. They're always let out at least a little bit. They just have to meet with a official. They can stay out as long as they follow the rules. They almost always keep their job, or the courts will order somebody to find a job and hire them under court supervision. They can stay with their families as long as they behave themselves. Community service is the most common penalty. 2,500 people a year are sentenced to community service, rather than almost half their prison population being thrown in, being in prison. And once again, if you actually get them in prison and you take away these rights, it just kills them. This is the last thing. We did send a delegation to Europe from the US. Delegates from Colorado, Georgia, and Pennsylvania went to the Netherlands to see their prison facilities, talk with the officials, and interact and talk with the inmates. all these guys had a very comprehensive knowledge of prisons in this country so that they could compare. Here's a comment that just popped out. If you treat inmates like humans, they act like humans. I just couldn't help but bring back Captain Obvious for that one. But we are at last actually making some serious efforts, even though we have a long way to go. And remember, the worst thing you can do to a European prisoner is just say, you can't go visit your family and friends.